Our reading today comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 12. I'm sure this will be a familiar reading to many of you, but at Luke chapter 12, I'm beginning to read at verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "Well, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They don't sow or reap, they have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wild flowers grow. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it, for the pagan world runs after such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give to the poor, provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. We thank the Lord for the reading of his word. And my question, I have to say, preacher, preach to yourself. My question to you and to me is, so where is your treasure? Where is your treasure? I want to begin by telling you two stories, and they both involve the same person. The person is called Richard Carter, and he is currently an associate minister at St. Martin in the Fields, big Church of England in Trafalgar Square in London. And Richard began his ministry as chaplain to a monastic community way over in the Solomon Islands. And he has some fascinating and sometimes quite tragic stories to tell about his time there. But he came back to the UK and entered into local church ministry, and for a good few years now he's been the associate minister at St. Martin in the Fields, a well-known church. I'm sure you've heard of it, especially for the work they do with the homeless and the down and outs on the streets of London. A few years ago he had a sabbatical, and he believed that God might be calling him back to some sort of monastic living. But while on sabbatical, he felt the Lord speak to him very clearly that no, the work he was doing was the work he was called to do, and he should stay at St. Martin. When he came back from the sabbatical, he wrote a book. It's actually one of the most incredible books I've read for a long time. It's called The City is My Monastery. And that basically tells the story. The city is my monastery. And it's a wonderful book of little stories and anecdotes. It has poems, it has prayers, and it's basically his journey of how he sees God at work on the streets of the City of London, where he ministers in the church and so on. So that's the first story. The second story also relates to Richard Carter, but it also relates to my late father-in-law. My father-in-law was a regular worshipper at St. Martin's, so he knew Richard Carter. We're talking now early 2017. Earlier the year before, he'd been diagnosed as terminally ill. And he was on his own, his wife had died sometime previously. He asked if he could come and spend his final few weeks with us in Cardiff. So we warmly welcomed him, made him at home, and then for the last 10 days or so, he was in the hospice in Penarth. A very, very sincere and devout Christian, and very involved at St. Martin's in London. Just a few days before he died, Richard Carter came on the train. I understood later it was on his day off. He came on the train all the way to Penarth to share communion with my father-in-law. And so when we bought the book, The City is My Monastery, my wife was reading it one evening, sitting in the chair, and I heard her at one point go, "Oh my goodness." And there, about halfway through the book, is Richard's account of his sharing communion with her father by name. There's her father's name in the book. Oh my gosh. And it's just one of the anecdotes he tells about, it's not saying anything confidential, but it's saying what Richard himself learned from his conversation with my father-in-law. It is an extraordinary book. And I tell you those stories because actually some of the sentiment behind what I want to say and what I want to share actually has come from my reading that book. And also it matches very, very closely with this question about, well, where is your treasure? What does it mean to store up treasure in heaven? And I'm going to suggest three words, that's all. 3 words that might guide us into what it might mean to store up treasure in heaven as we live on earth today. So, what are these 3 things? Firstly, simplicity. Simplicity. The Christian life should be marked by simplicity. And we've read together the well-known parable. It's called in the NIV the parable of the rich fool. But you know the story well. It's the man whose whole purpose for living seems to have been to acquire things, to get more and more and more. And so on this occasion he grows a bumper crop, so much that his barns are too small. So he knocked down his barns, build bigger ones, store everything away, and then he'll be able to save up for later years and retire in comfort, take life easy, eat, drink, be merry, and so on. And isn't that in many ways a description of the value of our consumer society today? Isn't that how our consumer society tends to work? We buy more. We want the next best thing. You have a mobile phone, it's out of date in 18 months, 2 years, so you have to buy another one. Well, that's what they tell you anyway. And so on and so on. And of course, part of the cost of living crisis we're facing today is actually partly an issue because it's challenging this. We're finding people can't afford to get the next best things. People are having to live on what they can. Now, I want to say, of course, it's right and proper that we take care of our futures. It's sensible when you're working to have a pension and so on. And all of that is sensible. I'm not saying we shouldn't be lacking sense in any way. We need to be wise. But the real problem is when this desire for more becomes greed. Greed. And that's clearly the point that Jesus is making. Because in verse 15, he said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed." Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. And you know the story of this rich fool who wanted to store up all his grain in bigger barns, and you know the story well. God calls time. He says, "You fool, tonight your life will be demanded of you." What's going to happen then to all this stuff you've hoarded? Reminds me of a little poem by William Blake called "The Fly." "Little fly, thy summer's play my thoughtless hand has brushed away. Am I not a fly like thee, or art thou not a man like me? For I dance and drink and sing, till some blind hand shall blush my wing." But it is true, isn't it, that sometimes we see in our lives around us, we're so busy building and storing up for the future, and all that pales into insignificance when some tragedy strikes. Jesus said this is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God. So in essence, we have to live in this world, of course we do, but we're not to swallow the world's values. Resist greed. In other words, live simply. Simplicity. You got that? Simplicity. One word, two more words to come. One word, simplicity, is one way at least, in which we store up treasure in heaven. The second word is trust. Specifically, trust God to provide. I always remember when I was interviewed, I think I said last time, I studied at Spurgeon's College in London, and I always remember at the interview, there's a group interview, and they asked me, so how are you going to, we had a young family, how are you going to live if you come here full time as a student? And I thought I'd say the spiritual answer. I said, well, I'm sure God will provide. And then one of the tutors grinned at me. He said, yes. He said, but how? How? And actually I could tell him, because we had a support group in the church who had already promised certain financial support. Oh, fine. Always asking the sensible question. That's good. So, however, what is one of the main problems in our society today? I want to suggest to you it's anxiety. The Western world is built on it in the main. People worry about their jobs, the economy, the cost of living, families. And a lot of that is understandable because we love people, we care for people, so we worry about people. I'm sure you know what it is to worry about something or somebody. Yes, yeah, well, I do anyway. We do. We're human beings. That's what it's part of being human. But we don't help ourselves either. So the world seems to thrive on setting higher and higher goals, causing people to worry more and more about how they're going to achieve it, So you get in work and you work for a promotion, you get a position, and then it's like, oh no, I've got to meet all those targets and goals. And then it's like the pressure comes on more and more, and so on and so forth. And I'm not really convinced we're supposed to live like that. Anxiety can be a killer. Stress is the disease of the modern age. So when Jesus says, do not worry, wow, we need to maybe stop and listen. Let me read again. I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear, for life is more than food, and the body is more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They don't sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. How much more valuable you are than birds. The only antidote to worry is to know that there is a Father God who loves us, who cares for us, who wants the best for us, and who loves you with an intimacy far greater than you and I will ever understand. God is our Father, who wants the very best for us. And I know, let's be honest, I know that being a Christian doesn't take away anxiety and worry. Goodness me, let's be honest. And yet, at heart, there is all the difference in the world when you know that the God who created all things knows you, loves you, cares for you, wants the best for you. So he is worthy of your trust. Do not be anxious. Your future, our future, is in his hands. You believe that? One more word. Simplicity, trust, and the last word is this: generosity. Generosity. This is what it is to store up for yourself treasure in heaven. You see, when greed gnaws away at our hearts, you will never learn the art of generosity. Do not be afraid, verse 32, little flock, your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. That's pretty radical stuff, isn't it? That really is radical. A lifestyle based on generosity. One more story from Richard Carter's book. Every morning they open the doors. They have a cafe, restaurant in the basement. They call it the crypt. And every morning they open the door to some of the homeless who've been sleeping around, and they get a fair crowd who know it happens every day. They wait outside. He said it was been a particularly cold winter's night, very cold indeed. And he was concerned. There was one fairly elderly gentleman who was in the queue just waiting to go in. And he said you could see his fingertips were blue. And he really was worried that he could have hypothermia even, And he was wearing not very much at all. And so Richard went up to him and he said, have you not got anything warmer to wear? No. He said, no, I lost my thick jumper. With that, there was a younger man standing behind him in the queue with a rucksack on. Pulled off his rucksack, pulled out a thick jumper and gave it to the man ahead of him. Keep it. Keep it, he said. Generosity from a younger man who basically was living on the streets. He didn't have anything. But he had something he could give. And Richard Carter says in his book, I just caught a glimpse of Jesus. And these words, generosity. So, I think one of the risks and one of the dangers is sometimes when we look at the scale of the problems around our world, sometimes we say, well, how can I make a difference? You can make a difference. Who was it? £400 raised this week? 400, see? Sometimes you think, well, who am I? What can I do? You can do a lot to help. You can do an awful lot to help. We can all make a difference we can choose to live more simply, to give more generously in the cause of goodness and justice. It's all about your attitude. It's about what you prioritize. In short, it's about where your treasure is. So I ask again as I finish. So where's your treasure? Where's your treasure? I finish with a quote. German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You live in the world. God has placed you in it, and in it you are to do the will of God. Enjoy what you can enjoy, but don't lose your heart to the world. Our heart belongs to eternity. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Amen.